Welcome to Talk New West.
All right, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, take us back to that January day in 1906 and the steamship SS Valencia.
Mhm.
It's off the coast of southwest Vancouver Island. Could you set the scene for us?
Yeah, for sure. Um, so the Valencia had left a few days prior from San Francisco, according to schedule. She was traveling up the coast, and like a lot of shipwrecks, she hit some bad weather. The navigation techniques at the time were also fairly poor according to modern standards. So the crew actually didn't really know where they were. They thought they were in Washington State. So what ended up happening is they ended up going basically straight into Vancouver Island and ended up crashing on Pachina Point. Shortly or around midnight on the 22nd of January.
Okay, so it was stormy as it was.
Yeah, it was stormy. So dark, stormy. Those typical settings for shipwrecks, and yeah, just they didn't know where they were, and what might usually happen is captains would usually then take their vessel out further into more open water just to avoid potentially crashing onto shore. But that didn't happen. And I think that was mostly because, again, they thought they were along Washington State. So they thought they were further out from land than they actually were. So,
What was the extent of the rescue operations? Or it must have been pretty crude. I can't imagine.
um, yeah, well, there was a lot of attempts for this one, and they were actually critiqued a lot, in the aftermath of the tragedy. But what ended up happening is once, everyone became aware that there was a shipwreck. It wasn't actually until the next morning that people in Victoria and San Francisco and Seattle were made aware that the ship had wrecked. So once they found out, they sent out several vessels to the site to try and help. But unfortunately, the waves were just so tall around that area, and she had wrecked so close to shore, like she was only 100 meters away from cliffside. So it was just too dangerous for these rescue vessels to send out crew and rowboats to try and help, because they would have just, died right on scene as well. And then there was also, over the course of the 40 hours that she was sitting on the rocks, there were some rescue effort attempts from land. But unfortunately, again, even though they were only 100 meters away from land, it was complete cliffside. So those standing on land really had no tools available to them to help. So they were just standing there watching the scene unfold in an absolutely horrific way.
So okay, so this steamship, if I've got this right, it's crashed on the rocks, it's stuck on the rocks, it's being pounded by waves and wind,
Yeah.
and the rescuers are having desperate trouble to do any rescuing. So, and how many people died in this?
There were about 173 people who died, and there were 37 survivors.
So, do we know how those 37 did they manage to get off or?
Yeah, so there were survivors. So people got off at a couple different points in the tragedy. It's kind of a funny one to describe. There's just a lot of different things happening over those 40 hours that she was on the rocks. So when she first hit, there was just absolute chaos on board because no one really knew what to do. Unfortunately, and fatally for many, when they prior to leaving San Francisco, the crew did not go through normal like safety procedures or drills or anything. So when they did hit, the crew just didn't know what to do. So of course, a lot of people panicked as one would, and they just tried to get people out in lifeboats. But again, there was giant waves. There were rocks all around them. So unfortunately, most people who got into those lifeboats in the initial hours of the wreck ended up dying. With one lifeboat, however, there were some people who somehow managed to cling to the rocks and climb their way up the cliffside. I think there was about 7 or 9 individuals who managed to survive in that way. They ended up then, getting onto the cliffside. It was just complete forest area. There were no trails or anything around at that time. And so they made their way through the forest and ended up coming across a telegraph hut and managed to get a little signal out to the Cape Beale Light Station. So that was one group of survivors. Another group of survivors ended up getting away in another lifeboat in the next day, and they had left, the vessel, and they managed to get out. That lifeboat managed to stay stable in the waves, and they ended up rowing away from the vessel and also finding, safety on land. So that's another group of survivors. And then the final group of survivors got away in a life raft in the final hours of the wreck. They ended up just rowing out for quite a while in just open waters until one of the rescue vessels was able to pick them up.
So this shipwreck lasted over, it was 40 hours and then it sank, or?
Yeah. So it was one final giant crash that put her under.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Now, was there blame attached? Was there an inquest or anything like that?
Yeah, there was. So because she was an American vessel, there was a major inquest in the States on it. We also had a Canadian inquest as well. And at both inquests, there were, of course, the survivors came and gave testimony. They ended up placing blame largely on the captain. He did go down with the ship. They placed blame on the captain. They also placed blame on the fact that there were few navigational aids along the coastline. For example, they noted that there was no light station where she had wrecked. And so a year later, the Canadian government had established the Pachina Point light station. And then they also noted too that there was just, in terms of the rescue efforts from land, it was very, very difficult because it was just covered forest. They decided to then put in a trail. So that was the Dominion Life Saving Trail, which nowadays is known as the West Coast Trail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So now that area already had a reputation as the graveyard of the Pacific.
That's right.
So it shouldn't have been a big surprise that.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of shipwrecks in that area around, that time. So I think, nowadays we look back on it and have given it that reputation. I don't know if it had that reputation at that time. But yeah, the area is just very rocky. There's strong currents and tides, and yeah, the waves can just get quite rough along that area. So that's why a lot of shipwrecks have happened.
Okay, now in the promotional material I read about the exhibit, there's reference to mysterious objects and ghost stories.
Yes.
What's involved with that?
So let's start with the ghost stories. The ghost story started as early as 1910. Mariners along the coast started reporting that they were seeing a phantom ship. So they were seeing Valencia in full form, the ghost form, travel up the coast. And I guess this phantom ship would follow them up into Pachina Point where she had wrecked. And then the phantom ship would, it's described as kind of leaping and jumping on the rocks and then crashing down and disappearing. So yeah, it's one of the more well-known shipwreck-related ghost stories on our coast. So that's pretty crazy. And then mysterious objects, we've got in our collection here at the Maritime Museum of BC, we have a nameplate from one of the lifeboats from the Valencia. And this lifeboat was found actually by a tugboat operator in, I can't remember the exact year, but it was the early 1930s. So he was, traveling along in a tugboat along the coast, and he saw something kind of funny on land. So he went out to explore, and he saw just hiding away in some bushes and some trees was a lifeboat, and it had a nameplate along the side. And it said Valencia number 5. So he was a history buff, and so he knew exactly what this lifeboat was from. He didn't have the means to be able to drag the lifeboat out of the trees and bushes. So instead, what he did is he had an axe with him and he knocked off the nameplate. So we have that nameplate in our collection now, and that's on display. And yeah, the mystery around that one is just simply how did that lifeboat end up in the trees on shore? And how did it get stuck there? About 20 years or so after the wreck, right? It's just strange circumstances.
Well, okay, now this exhibit, what can you tell us about the exhibit? Like it's at the Maritime Museum in Victoria, and it runs how long?
Yeah, so we've got it on right now until September 2nd. So yeah, we're open to the public right now. We have our COVID safety procedures in place, of course. But yeah, we do recommend that people book an appointment in advance. We are limiting the amount of people in our space at one time, though we do take walk-ins if we have spaces available that day. So yeah, right now we're open Thursdays through Saturdays from 10 to 5. And then come Victoria Day long weekend, we'll be open Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 to 5 as well.
And hopefully we will get through this pandemic sooner rather than later. So
Yeah.
people from the mainland will be more comfortable visiting Victoria. And I think it's a fabulous opportunity to see something of BC maritime history. And I want to thank you very much for the
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.